Good evening. I'm Joe Nye, Dean of the Kennedy School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to the new season of the ARCO Forum at the Kennedy School. The mission of the Kennedy School is to train people for public leadership, and we're particularly fortunate then to have as the inaugural speaker for this year a man who has demonstrated public leadership both at the state level as a governor and at the national level as the Secretary of Education, and also as a candidate for president. But I will leave it to Alan Simpson to introduce Lamar Alexander to you. I just want to say that we're delighted to have you with us again at this forum. A word about the forum. The forum here at the Kennedy School is sometimes referred to as the extra course that we take. We're training people for public leadership. But what better way to do that than to expose them to people who have been leaders in the public? And in that sense, the curriculum that we use to teach our people, we're very proud of, but we regard the forum as good a course as any that we produce in the classroom. You will often find things here that are interesting. You will very rarely be bored. Occasionally you'll be entertained, but most of all we hope you will learn. And so we look forward to a good year again at the forum, under its leadership, the able leadership of Kathy McLaughlin and particularly Alan Simpson, who is the director of the Institute of Politics here. Alan Simpson himself is an example of public leadership. He spent more than 30 years in service to the public for the state of Wyoming, first as a state legislator and then for senator from Wyoming for 3 terms, rising to be Republican whip. And he came here on a brief stint after he left the Senate to be the Lombard visiting professor. He was so wildly popular with students and faculty alike that we prevailed upon him to become the director of the Institute of Politics here. So please join me in welcoming Alan Simpson to
That was very generous, Joe. Thank you. We had an auction here last year, and Joe preceded me at the podium, and the glare from the light seemed to paralyze the audience from our less than hirsute domes, and we auctioned off the toupees, or the actual hair we had when we were courting our wives. It was quite a thing. You would have loved it. We both had a luxuriant growth. It is nice to be back. Joe, it's a great honor and privilege to serve with you and you as our dean. And I just want to say, though, now I just got off the plane from Wyoming. The whole plane was filled with elk antlers. These guys have been out shooting them, and my bags are somewhere in Salt Lake. And what got me as I walked in, and I was quite taken aback. It was a mumbled statement, but I was somewhat offended, and I wanted to answer it right now. And the answer is, yes, I did sleep in this sport coat. So I'm glad to get that question out of the way. For whoever asked it, mumbled it back here, just sleep in that sport coat. But I did lose my luggage, and there was another fellow out there who was in the same predicament. And he went to that clerk, and he harassed and mumbled and shrieked at her, and finally he went back to the window 3 or 4 times, and I was listening. And she said, you know, let me put it this way. There are only really 2 people in the world who give a damn about your luggage, and one of them is losing interest rapidly. And so it will be here at 9 a.m., and I will be fully attired. Let me say about this man briefly, Lamar Alexander. I met him through Howard Baker. I came to the Senate in '79 and met Howard Baker, of course, who was our leader, and then became the majority leader of the Senate. And he introduced me to Lamar Alexander. Joe has shared with you his remarkable political credentials. He also campaigned for governor of Tennessee, began with a 1,000-mile walk across the state, and ended when He was sworn in 3 days early to replace a governor who was apprehended selling pardons for cash. Reminded me of the story of two guys in a pen in another state, and one turned to the other, said, "The food was better here when you were governor." But that's another story. But as head of the National Governors Association, Lamar focused the energies of this nation on improvement of schools. And his fundamental belief in quality education as a governor and as president of the University of Tennessee led President George Bush to make him United States Secretary of Education in 1991. And then, of course, as a Republican candidate for president in 1996, he led a campaign for less government, more power and resources for families, schools, and communities. He is now the co-founder of the Corporate Family Solutions Incorporated, now the Bright Horizons Family Solutions, a company that provides corporate child care and other family support services. He's written 7 books, including 6 months off, about his family's Australian experience. A very fascinating book. And Lamar Alexander's little plaid book of rules, lessons, and reminders about participating in public life. And that is what the Institute of Politics and the Kennedy School of Government is about, participating in public life. And he leads a campaign, the Campaign for a New American Century, a grassroots organization committed to promoting common sense, conservative agendas for the country. He and his wife, Honey, have 4 children, live in Nashville, and he also plays the piano. Harry Truman played the piano, too. I remember that. And it is nice to have you here this evening and to share your thoughts with us. This is one very highly respected American who has paid his dues over and over again in the public arena. Lamar. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. It's great to be back at Harvard, at the Kennedy School. I'm delighted to see you here. I was thinking of my first day as president of the University of Tennessee. Faculty member walked up and said, "Oh, Mr. Alexander, we admire your enthusiasm for your new job. You remind me of Clark Kerr." And I thought that was a great compliment because Clark Kerr had been the distinguished president of the University of California. And I said, how is that? And the faculty member said, "Well, you know, he arrived and left the same way, fired with enthusiasm." So the first day of classes anywhere is an important day. Alan Simpson was a great leader in the Senate. I know he is here. He and I both have learned what all of the students who are here will learn if you ever become candidates. Step number 1 is take a vow of humility, because you'll spend most of your time hoping no one says to you what they said to former Congressman Mo Udall when he ran for president. He walked into a barber shop, this is literally true in New Hampshire, stuck out his hand and said, "I'm Mo Udall running for president." And the barber barely looked up and said, "Yeah, I know. We were just laughing about that yesterday." It's good to be at the School of Government on the first day of classes for another reason. This is the time of an unusual amount of cynicism and disappointment about politics and government. And I just want to remind you what I suspect you know very well, or you wouldn't be here. It's not always been that way, and doesn't have to be that way, and it's up to you and to us to make sure it's not that way as we go into the new century. I was a student when President Kennedy was elected president. I remember the excitement that caused around the country, a lot of coats thrown over their shoulders as people began to get more interested in public service. I remember a few years after that when some Tennessee Republicans named Howard Baker, who Alan mentioned, and Bill Brock excited a lot of us about overturning a one-party political system. I remember 1980 when the country was in a so-called malaise, and a California governor named Ronald Reagan gave us a new sense of purpose and confidence. And I would expect that to happen again, because we have coming up a new century. We have new leaders in both parties. In the Republican Party, this is the first time since World War II that we really haven't had a distinguished leader of the World War II generation at the head of our pecking order. And we have new issues. We're moving from a century, or the end of a century, that I would characterize as a struggle for freedom, toward the beginning of a new century, which should begin with an age of responsibility. And that's worth being a part of, because it ought to bring out the best in all of us. So I salute you for where you are generally, and for particularly for being here tonight on the first day of a school year. Maybe this summer you saw Saving Private Ryan. A lot of Americans did. It's one more reminder that we've been led to the end of this century by the finest generation since our country's founding. I mean by that my parents' generation, who survived the soup lines, and who stormed Omaha Beach, who faced down the Soviets. Their legacy is secure. Their struggle for freedom created what we call the American century. The question for us, for all of us, is now what will our legacy be? And I don't want it to be that we just danced across the bridge to the future singing "We've Never Had It So Good." I hope when our grandchildren look back at this turn of the century, they see that we stepped up to our responsibilities in the world and our responsibilities at home, especially our responsibilities as parents raising children, which is why my mission for the Republican Party is to help our party be seen as the party on the side of parents raising children. And my purpose tonight is to talk for a few minutes about just one way to do that. I want to make, over those few minutes, an argument, a supply-side argument for a family-friendly tax code. And then I'll be interested in your comments and your questions about that, or anything else we have time to discuss. Let's start with the proposition that America needs a new family-friendly tax code. We have a 10,761-page monster which is described in a great many unflattering ways. It breeds tyranny, it discriminates against women, it stunts our growth, it takes too much of what we earn. We can make a list a mile long of adjectives. On this much, at least Republicans agree, and I suspect most Americans agree. But what Republicans don't agree about is what to replace it with. Some say a flat tax, which has gotten an awful lot of attention. Some say a new national sales tax. And I'm convinced that either one of those plans would be a mistake for our country and a mistake for our party. So I'm here to outline a few principles upon which I hope we can begin to write a third option, an option I've been talking about for most of this year. Instead of a flat tax or a sales tax, I believe we need a new family-friendly tax, a new simpler code with too low rates that puts a higher value on the work of parents raising children. Simply put, it's a new tax code which is not indifferent to the values that we think are most important in our society. For example, to help parents raise children, it would triple the tax deduction for each child to $8,000, make it worth what it used to be. To put the government unambiguously on the side of marriage, it would end the marriage penalty. To encourage parental involvement in their children's education, it would create education savings accounts. It would help with retirement security by creating individual security accounts and make it possible for that money to be used for a problem that a great many families are finding more and more pressing. That is the care of older relatives. To promote farm and home ownership, it would keep the home and farm mortgage interest deduction. And finally, it would create a new national standard for giving, or at least encourage it, by creating what we might call the half tithe. We would double the deduction for charitable giving for those who give more than 5% of their income. Now, while these pro-family tax cuts ought to be, in my opinion, the first priority, I think we should, at the same time, in any new tax code, pledge allegiance to the pro-growth tax cuts that gave us the prosperity that we have today. That would mean across-the-board tax cuts, reducing rates as much as is practical. My idea of the ideal top eventual rate would be 28%, which was the rate of the Reagan years, that not only Mr. Reagan, but Senator Bradley and Mr. Gephardt agreed on at that time. That would effectively repeal the Bush and Clinton tax hikes of 1991 and 1993. In addition, I believe the capital gains tax should be lowered to 15%, and that estates should be taxed at the new Reagan rates, as we might call them, which would roughly cut those in half. Those would be the principles of this new family-friendly tax code. Here's what I'm trying to get at. My party, the Republican Party, for a long time has been known as the party of free markets, of the party of a strong defense, and I hope it always is. But I would like for people to think of the Republican Party as something more than that. I would like for Americans to think of the Republican Party as the party on the side of parents raising children. And to do that, I suggest we use the same supply-side economic philosophy that we use to help produce the prosperity we have today. Now, here's what I mean by that. The Reagan tax cuts in the 1980s, like the Kennedy tax cuts in the 1960s, proved the supply-side thesis, which is that incentives matter. In other words, changing tax policy can help change taxpayers' behavior. Congress cut taxes, lowered the top rates. Senator Simpson was right there in the middle of it. As a result of that, taxpayers worked harder, saved more, invested more, and helped create the boom we enjoy today. In the 1980s, the supply-side revolution was in response to what was then called a misery index, the painful combination of inflation plus unemployment. Today, we might say we have a new misery index, the painful combination of broken families and troubled children. Half our marriages end in divorce. A third of our babies are born to unmarried parents. 1/4 of high school seniors can barely read, according to the nation's report card, and 1/4 use illegal drugs at least once a month. We read stories and know instances of children having children, children killing children, and parents are working so hard they don't seem to have the same amount of time for children that our parents had for us. That's why I believe it's time to give pro-family values the same kind of support we gave pro-growth values 20 years ago. Government can't raise children. That's the responsibility of parents. But at least parents deserve a government that doesn't make it harder. And once we had such a government, my parents had a government squarely on their side. Seems hard to remember this, but then the federal government favored married taxpayers. There was a tax deduction for each child then that amounted to 3 times what it's worth today. The payroll tax then was 1%. VA mortgages helped with homes for young families. The GI Bill helped with education. That was the GI Bill for veterans. And for the most part, the government operated safe neighborhood schools where children learned what they needed to know. In other words, the government spent quite a bit of money strengthening families instead of hiring so-called experts and substitutes for families. Now, just look at what the government has been doing to families since that time. It's been paying people not to marry and penalizing them when they do. It's made divorce easier, adoption harder, and discipline illegal in some cases. It's all but given up in the fight on drugs. And then the elites have piled on and told us that marriage is old-fashioned, that fathers are unnecessary, and Jerry Springer is our new substitute teacher. And as Paul Harvey says, you know the rest of the story. It's not too much to say that for the last 30 years, our government and our culture has been waging a war against parents raising children, and the result's been a disaster for our children and a disaster for our country. There's growing recognition of this. I brought with me just a couple of books. One really comes from the left. It includes a Harvard faculty member, Cornel West, Sylvia Ann Hewlett. The title is The War Against Parents. One comes from the right. It's called The Assault on Parenthood by Dana Mack. They both are important. They both have different solutions, but they have the same diagnosis, that we've let the government and the culture wage a war against parents. So I think the great new challenge for our country, and therefore I hope for our party, is to put The Republican Party on the side of stopping the war against parents and coming down squarely on the side of parents raising children. That's what gets me to the tax code, because nothing has done more damage to parents than the federal tax code. According to the Heritage Foundation, families with children pay 5 times the amount of federal taxes today, 5 times that they did in the 50s. It's up from 5% to 25% of their income. Just as surely as high tax rates crowded out investment and job creation in the 70s and the 80s, the tax burden borne by families today is literally crowding out our children, leaving busy parents with fewer resources and less time to be good parents. A new tax code that places a higher value on the work of parents raising children can help to change this. The center of the tax code is tripling the deduction for each child to $8,000. And unlike some other proposals, it doesn't discriminate against parents who choose to use the money to stay home and care for their own children. Ending the marriage penalty sends an unequivocal message. Tripling the tax deduction would put about $2,500 in the pocket of a family that has a taxable income of about $50,000 a year. The marriage deduction is worth another $1,400 for the average married couple. That's getting to be real money. Let me give you an example of what I mean. I was at Yonkers department store headquarters in the Midwest a few weeks ago. They have stores all over the Midwest, and they were very proud of the fact that they have about 7,500 sales associates, about 75% of those female. And in order to keep good employees, they now do something very different in the workplace. They let the employees write their work schedules. So if an employee has an elderly mother and wants to be off on Friday to care for that mother, then that employee works 32 hours a week, Fridays are off. Or if there's a second grader and that father wanted to be home at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the parent could do that. That gives them permission to do it. The family-friendly tax code would help them afford to do it by leaving extra dollars in their pocket. The code that I described includes education savings accounts, such as those created or suggested by Senator Paul Coverdale. Individual security accounts, as I mentioned, would help provide for retirements and create extra dollars to help with caring for older relatives. The new standard for giving, 5%, could be very important. Americans are very generous, more than any other country in the world, but we give only about 2% of our income to charitable causes. If we encouraged more giving and a standard of 5%, that would be money for many organizations that support coaches and scoutmasters and church leaders and others who then support parents who raise children. How would we pay for all this? Well, over the next 10 years, some projections are that the surplus will be as much as $1.8 trillion. If government spending grows no faster than inflation, and I think it should not, plus some money, maybe 15 to 20 billion annually for targeted increases, including, I would suggest, national defense, that still would leave a good amount of money to give money back to the taxpayers, and I would start with parents raising children. I mentioned a little earlier my concern about the only options that seem to be coming out of the Republican Party for a new tax code, the sales tax and the flat tax. And let me say briefly what my problems are with those and why I think neither are realistic options. First, the sales tax. It would replace the 1040 form and all the other forms that come out of the IRS, but it would produce a new bureaucratic nightmare, either at the federal level or the state level, as we sought to exempt poor people from this huge new national sales tax. It would transfer authority from the states and the communities to Washington because states and communities rely on the sales tax, and a big national sales tax would squeeze the local tax base. And it would force older Americans who've been saving and earning money and paying taxes on money all of their life to suddenly be paying a big new tax on everything they buy. So I don't think the sales tax is going to fly. As for the single rate flat tax, it simply isn't what it appears to be. To begin with, it isn't flat. Hundreds of thousands who live off investment income would pay zero, and so would millions of poor people. Second, it really doesn't get rid of the IRS, as it's always promised to do. And third, the flat tax doesn't meet President Reagan's criteria for tax reform: simplicity, growth, and fairness. I'm certain a flat tax would lower Steve Forbes' taxes. It would lower my taxes. My retired mother will pay no taxes because she doesn't have much income. So all of the young people in the audience might want to think, who's going to make up the difference? I think it will be my middle-income children who are just getting started out in their lives. So if I were an American earning between, say, $35,000 and $100,000 a year, I would check out the revenue-neutral flat tax very carefully and make sure it's not a tax increase instead of a tax cut. Now, you may say, wait a minute, under your two-rate tax system, some of us will pay more than others, and you'd be right about that. I think that's fair. The trade-off is, I make more than you do, I pay a little higher rate, lower than any rate we now have, and what I get back for that are stronger families and parents doing a better job of raising children. I'm glad to do that. You may also say, but your family-friendly tax code means that the tax code is taking sides, expressing preferences. You'd be right again, because when it comes to growth, or when it comes to parents raising children, I believe we want our tax code to be taking sides and expressing preferences. Our side, we want a tax code that reflects our most important values. We would never think about having a value-neutral spending policy for the $1.7 trillion the federal budget spends every year. How we raise the money, the $1.7, also makes a difference. We shouldn't have a morally neutral tax code any more than we should try to have a morally neutral school or a morally neutral appropriations bill. Some would say, and I believe that our greatest problem in our country right now is that we are losing our capacity to say as a nation that some things are right and some things are wrong. In a free society, there always have to be some common standards that we live by and some common principles that unite us. And the most important of these should be reflected in our most important laws, including our tax code. That's why the biggest problem with the sales tax and with the flat tax is that both are indifferent to the value that needs the most attention in America today, and that is honoring the job of father and mother. Larry Lindsay, who used to be a professor of economics at Harvard, is coming out with a new book, and he tries to explain how President Reagan worked on his pro-growth policies, and basically he says that the strategy was to focus on markets and to free them of impediments as much as possible, and then to use the tax code to encourage pro-growth behavior, and out of that created the environment that produced our growth. It's the same idea with families, to focus on families and get rid of the impediments that make it hard for them to be strong. Make it easier for employers to give employees flexible working hours. That would help. Make it easier for parents to have a choice of a good, safe school for their child. That would help. Working as hard to stop drugs at the border as we do to send missiles around the corner in Baghdad. That would help. Making adoption easier would help. All of these government actions would remove impediments to strong families, and then the tax code can encourage behavior that strengthens families, encouraging marriage, making possible for parents to afford to choose to spend more time with their children, encouraging parents to be involved in their children's education, to take better care of older relatives, to provide for their own retirement, to encourage givers to give more to organizations that help parents. But of course, there's a limit to what the government can do. Just as the government couldn't actually create private sector jobs in the 1980s and the 90s, because that was the responsibility of the savers and the investors and the workers, the government can't raise children either. Only we, the parents, can. Only we, the parents, can read to toddlers and turn off the TV and teach our children standards to live by. Only we can insist that the next generation understand that children having children is wrong, and that marrying before you have a child is right, and if you conceive a child, you have a responsibility to that child. Only we, the parents, can make our schools the best and our homes drug-free. We're the ones who can help our children understand why their great-grandparents stormed those beaches and stood in those soup lines, and why they're proud to be a citizen of a nation of immigrants, but even prouder to say, we are all Americans. Only we, the parents, can insist that our professional athletes and our politicians, right on up to our president, set a good example for our children. We know that character counts, and we know that incentives matter too. In the 1980s, placing a higher value on work, savings, and investment helped rebuild the American economy. As we enter the new century, placing a higher value on the work of parents raising children will help rebuild the American family, and I believe would be the right first step to beginning the new century with an age of responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lamar. And now the meat of the ARCO Forum, the questions from the audience. And so if you will take either one of those microphones, please, and step forward and just line up if you want to have something to say. Thank you so much. And so first, this young man right there, please.
Mr. Alexander, I want to say thank you for your consideration of the tax code and its justice with things like the mortgage tax deduction.
Excuse me, I'd love to know where you're from, if you don't mind telling me that.
Oh, sure. My name's Will Bain. I'm from Athens, Ohio, which
Great.
is a small
Thank
town.
you, Will.
No, I want to say thank you for your consideration for things that do provide justice, tax justice to Americans, such as the mortgage tax deduction, earned income tax credit. And thanks for your hope, too. But I have a question for you. It's important to be on the side of families and parents, but what's going to provide hope and help for people in areas like Roxbury, South Boston, just in this area, but across the nation? I come from Appalachia. I know that this will be a help, but those people also need housing, they need health care, they need things like that to help them raise their children. How will that fit into your plan? Just curious.
Well, thanks for the question. I come from Appalachia, too. Maryville, Tennessee, as a matter of fact. What this would do is to help give, first to create a growth economy which gives jobs. The town in which I grew up in the center of Appalachia was lucky enough to have an Alcoa plant there, so we had 3 generations of people with good jobs. That solved a lot of other problems. So an economy that can grow jobs. The second thing it would do is get the tax code back on the side of families raising children so they can teach children what they need to know, afford to provide for them, have the option of getting them to a good, safe neighborhood school, provide for the care of their elderly relatives, and it would also encourage those who have more money to give their charitable contributions to the Salvation Army, the Boys and Girls Club, and other organizations that back up parents. The objective here is not to create more government programs that substitute what families can do, but to strengthen the family by leaving more money in the family's pocket and creating an environment in which the family can succeed.
Thanks.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Keith. I'm from Grand Rapids, Michigan. I had a question for you relating to your plan and also relating to Social Security.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that you would pay for the tax deductions through the projected federal budget surpluses.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's my understanding that much of the surplus is going to go into the Social Security Trust Fund. And clearly, the surplus that's going to be available for general government use just isn't going to be there. What do you propose to do about Social Security so that some of that revenue can be used in the application of reducing the burden of these tax deductions you propose?
Well, I agree that it would be wise to save Social Security first. And President Clinton, until he has been distracted recently, was on a pretty good path to create an environment that was bipartisan. that might cause that to happen as soon as next year. And that would include using some of the surplus that's anticipated, but not all of it. Then I think there's still going to be a new, if you want an example of good thinking on that subject, I think Senator Breaux of Louisiana and Senator Gregg of New Hampshire, who have a comprehensive proposal out that would rebate 2% of the payroll tax to individual savings accounts, which individuals could then invest under certain conditions, with some other changes, is a good example of the kind of reform that we could have with Social Security. I think if the Congress and the President would get together, they could have that done in the next 12 months. We're still going to have a new tax system. And what I'm suggesting is some of that money should be given back to parents raising children. I've been very careful here to outline principles and not a plan. And I know very well you can't take the top rate down to 28% and give every child an $8,000 deduction all at the same time. I would start by increasing the tax deduction for every child. That would be my first priority, and I would start with the youngest children. But I would save Social Security first. I think we have to get that settled, and I would hope the President and the Congress could do it in the next 12 months.
Thanks.
Sir.
We don't have any microphones up there tonight.
Okay.
Hi, I'd like to take my turn in thanking you for coming to talk to us tonight.
Thank you.
This question may be a little bit redundant on top of the one that was just asked, but how close to being revenue neutral with respect to our present tax code do you anticipate your family-friendly tax code being? And if you think the total revenues collected would be significantly below what we're collecting now, what sorts of cuts might you propose to make up the difference?
That's actually a very good question, which I appreciate. I think we need to compare proposals for a new tax system on a revenue-neutral basis. It's easy to get up and say we're going to do all this and cut taxes. So the principles that I've got would be the principles upon which to build a tax system, and I would start out with a revenue-neutral tax code. Now, I do then think there should be tax cuts. I would, many of the things that I recommended would reduce the amount of money that the government takes in over the next several years. I do not want to see the government take all of that $1.8 trillion surplus that may be coming in the next 10 years. I would like to see it given back to the taxpayers. And I think a reasonable forecast for that is to say that the government shouldn't spend more money each year than the growth of inflation would permit. That would be about 3% more, and add another 15 to 20 billion on for targeted spending increases. That's just realistic. I think there should be some. Defense is an example. That would leave probably 60 to 80 billion dollars, depending on the condition of the economy every year, which could be given back to the taxpayers. Now, that's as far as I can go in projecting the amount of money that might be available, but I would give that money back as a tax cut. That's the size of the tax cut. What would we cut in the federal government? In my experience in making up budgets, the only way you can do it is put a limit on the amount of money you're taking in and set your priorities each year. It's very hard to identify far out what the cuts will have to be. We could start with the work that Congress has already done, which goes all the way through the various departments of government and creates spending limits. Those are, if we just stick to that, we'll have a big surplus.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Shane. I'm from Denver, Colorado. And I'm wondering how your proposal would help families whose incomes are low enough that they aren't actually part of the tax system.
Well, that would be the first way it would help them. They wouldn't pay any tax. There would still be an earned income tax credit, which is basically a refundable tax. The tax proposal, let's see, going through those ideas, doubling the charitable deduction might help those persons, because that might mean more money for the Boys and Girls Club, the Salvation Army, the local school, the after-school program. But other than exempting them from paying tax and creating an environment in which there are a lot of good jobs, those would be the main benefits. There are many other ways to help parents raising children. I think our objective after we put the tax code on their side would be to get the schools on their side. That would mean give poor parents choices of the best schools, give them a ticket to a good school, just the same way you can take a federal voucher to Harvard or UMass or Brigham Young or wherever else you might want to go. A third way would be to make it easier for employers to give employees more flexible working hours. That gives especially poor parents more flexibility in helping with their children. And then the fourth thing would be drugs and the culture. A drug-free workforce, a better job of stopping drugs at the border. I've suggested a new branch of the armed services dedicated simply to managing that problem. All of that would make it easier for all parents, including poor parents. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Harold Connor, and I'm from Memphis, Tennessee.
Good for you.
I remember when you were governor.
Thank you for
My mom
that.
told me often about you walking through Tennessee, the plaid shirts, and I wanted to ask you a question about my mom in particular. My mother is a teacher in the Memphis City school systems, which you know, teachers aren't paid very well.
Where does she teach?
She teaches at Treadwell Elementary.
Great.
My question is, I know you're for education, and education is important. In order to get education within the public schools, you need great teachers. And in today's society, there's a trend toward the good teachers going into the private sector or universities. The teachers that do become public school teachers are usually the teachers that are not so hot or barely made it through college. We're having a bigger tendency toward this. And the biggest factor I see in this is the salary, which is comparably, a person with my mom's education should make about $50,000 more a year. And so my question is, how do you feel that we should address this? Do you feel that the national government should step in, or should there be higher salaries given by the state? Or how do you feel we should address this problem?
I agree with your analysis exactly, since I believe incentives matter. I think if your salaries are higher, you're more likely to keep good teachers, which is why, and if they had left in place the master teacher program that I got started in Tennessee and was in place when I left in 1986, and your mom were at the top of that, she probably would be making $50,000 a year more. Because we put in place, after a year-and-a-half battle with the National Education Association, a plan that would have raised the pay of the state contribution to the pay of all teachers by 20% and of the best teachers by 70%. And I would have put a cost of living increase on that on a regular basis. Now, in return for that, they had to be evaluated every 5 years, and we had 10,000 teachers who went through it. But as soon as I got out of office, it was the NEA came whooping back in and started changing it and turning it into an automatic pay raise, and it's a real tragedy. But if that were still in place, the best teachers in Tennessee would be paid $80,000 or $100,000 a year, and I think they should be. But I think they need to be evaluated, they need to give up. I don't think any of that kind of pay should be tenured. I think you should continue to earn it or on some orderly basis. But I think paying teachers more who are good would be the way to do that. And the second way to get some of the money for that is to get rid of all the overhead, which is created by the government regulations and the union rules. I mean, one simple math equation, if you got 20 kids per classroom, and that's about the number of children per teacher in our system. Now you'll say, wait a minute, you don't know what you're talking about. Some classrooms have 35, but if you divide the number of teachers, the number of students, it's about 20 to 1. And we spend about $5,000 per student. That gets up to about $100,000 a year. Well, a good teacher in the Memphis system might make 35 or 40, and benefits might be another 5 or 10. Well, where does the other 50 go? It goes to overhead. So if we squeeze the overhead and get rid of that and pay good teachers more, we could pay them well. We would not have a teacher shortage of any kind under that circumstance. I don't think the federal government should do that. The states should do it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Governor. My name is Jeremy Pemmel, and that was a great segue. I'm actually a graduate student in the education school. And my question is actually two questions, if you would indulge me, but they're related. I came to the ed school looking to answer a question, and that is, what is the role of the private sector in revitalizing our inner city schools and education policy reform, and what incentives do they have? So I would like your thoughts on that, the role of the private sector and corporations in playing their part in this new age of responsibility. And the second part of the question is more specifically to your tax code. You spoke of deduction, increasing the deduction for charitable donations as individuals. Would you encourage increasing tax deductions for corporations to make more charitable deductions? And if not, what incentives do you think the government can provide, if any, to encourage corporations to play a larger part in the problems of America when the government seems to be stepping back from some of its traditional days from the industrial age?
Well, that's an interesting, I'll have to think about that. I did not include corporations in my idea, and I'll have to check and see how much that would cost.
Not that I'm totally advocating a corporate tip
No,
or whatever.
but I should have an answer to that. I'll think about that. I like the idea of individual responsibility because with the money goes the person's interest. At least I think that's the way it should go, and that's the way it works with me. But I'll think about that, and I'll find out how much it costs. And I'm glad you brought that up. So far as the private sector, I've wrestled with that a long time. A lot of the companies try to adopt a school, that kind of thing. That doesn't do a bit of harm, doesn't do much good.
Right.
What needs to happen is the school systems need to be unshackled. And since corporations have had to go through this over the last 20 years, they need to help local school systems understand they need to do it too. I mean, corporations have had to overhaul themselves and downsize and get rid of overhead and restructure all this business. They should help schools do that as well. So I'd like to see corporations get behind teachers and principals and legislators and community leaders who really want to change the school system. And it would be very simple. You'd simply give every school the same freedom that a Massachusetts charter school has. That'd be number 2. And then let the money follow every child to the school that their parents think is best. And overnight, that would dramatically change our school system, put a lot more money into the classrooms, make teaching more enjoyable, and upgrade the academic achievement of students. But that's getting done so slowly, we may be in another millennium before it happens.
Thank you, sir.
Yes.
Good evening. My name is Alex Athanasio. I'm a native of Massachusetts. And basically, I had one quick question for you.
Mm-hmm.
In this current age, there are really two necessities or two important realities that a lot of working parents face.
Mm-hmm.
One is the need for higher education for their kids.
Mm-hmm.
In today's world, you can't get a decent paying job. Working at Burger King won't cut it unless you have some sort of advanced degree. And secondly, daycare. For a lot of working parents, daycare, the costs are astronomical.
Mm-hmm.
I today signed my promissory notes for student loans, and college for me seems like an intrinsic part of any sort of comprehensive family plan. And similarly, daycare, I think, would be an integral part, rather, of that as well. I didn't see any real substantive efforts or drives made in your speech to address those, and I was just wondering if you'd like to comment on that.
Sure, I'd be glad to, and I agree with you about the importance of those. You have the privilege of going to Harvard, which is very expensive, and fortunately it's not the only great university in America. I mean, the tuition at the University of Texas is $1,000 a year if you're from Texas. And at the University of North Carolina, it's $2,000, and University of Tennessee, it's $2,000. And particularly in the honors programs in those schools, you can get a terrific education. I don't mean that as any slam on Harvard, because I think this is a spectacular institution, and anyone who has the opportunity to go here ought to try to take advantage of it, and I've encouraged students to do it. But it's not the only choice. So what we've done in our country is more than any other country in the world, or more than all the rest of the countries put together, we've created quality higher education opportunities that are affordable. Many of our community college programs for the first 2 years of an undergraduate education are extraordinarily good. I know when I was at the University of Tennessee, some of our best professors left to go teach at the community college because they didn't want to fool with all the research, they just wanted to teach. and there you can go for free if you need the money. So I believe that higher education is available. Now, a Harvard education is expensive, and you'll be paying that back a while. I also think it's a good investment, and would recommend it. What else can the government do about that? I'm not sure that the government should raise sales taxes on people who are making relatively low incomes to spend more on higher education for students. The recent Hope Scholarship that the Congress and the President agreed on increases opportunities even beyond where they have been. The one need we do have is I'd like to see the Pell Grant higher, because for the poorest students, who are the ones who really need the most help, it's not enough to make a difference at many of the better universities.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Tad. I'm from Washington, D.C. And I was wondering about your plan to lower the estate tax, and you're talking about fairness in the tax code, and I'm wondering how it's fair that, like, a child who's, not me, but a child who would be set to inherit like $10 million, how it would be fairness in the tax code to lower the amount of taxes on that. You know, he already has tons of advantages in life, and I don't see how it's making it fair to lower that tax.
Well, that's a matter of public policy, and you've made a very good point. There's another way to look at that, which is that if I work all my life and create a small company, which may be worth $10 million, or if I own a third-generation farm in North Dakota, which might not be too big and still might be worth a couple of $1 million because the land's so expensive out there, when I die, they have to sell the farm or sell the business and break it up because the taxes are so high. And that seems unfair to me. I would like to pass that on to my children, because that's one of my motives, maybe my main motive of working that long. Also, it seems to me it's in the public's interest not to force the breakup of individual businesses, for example. Then there's just the simple question of, this is a country where we prize freedom. People came here to be free as much as possible and to make money, and the sky was the limit. In the European countries and other countries around the world, there were limits on that. You could only keep an acceptable amount of money and keep some amount. The tradition in America has been, that's not the way we operate. This is a country where you come and you make it and you keep it, and we keep more of what we earn. And my proposal is not to end the death tax, but to lower the tax rates to the level of the other top rates, which I would hope someday would not exceed 28 or 30%, which I think is still a pretty stiff tax on what someone has built and earned over one lifetime, or what their parents and grandparents have helped to build up.
Thank you.
Time for two more questions, one here at this microphone and then one there. So thank you. Two more.
Hi, my name is Erin Ashwell, and I'm from Huddleston, Virginia. Both of my parents work in public education, and over the years I've listened to the 10 o'clock phone calls when some irate parent calls and just basically yells at my dad. I'm concerned that there is a growing sentiment against public schools. You spoke about there being bad schools, and there are bad schools. I've heard of some horrible things. There are good teachers and there are good administrators, and if we allow people who take a genuine interest in their schools to run out, I feel like that's betraying the educators and people like my parents who have really dedicated their lives to education. How can you keep that from happening?
To keep from running out, I mean, who do you mean?
Well, basically, and I don't want to speak on stereotypes, but a lot of the problems that arise come from low socioeconomic households. It has been the experience, my mom works with preschool handicap, that those people do not take the interest in their children. They would not be likely to move their children from one school to another if they felt there was a problem. So what I'm afraid will happen, particularly if we allow parent choice in schools, is the people who do care, who do take the effort, will leave a school, and administrators will be left with a mess.
You're on a very important point, and this is a good place for a next to last question to end. The choice fundamentally is, do you trust the parents or do you not? Now, there are always going to be a few parents who are abusive, who are terrible, and that's always true in a free society. But are we going to try to give more control to the government or are we going to give more control to the parents? And I believe that over the last 35 years, we have gradually eroded the parents' responsibility and the ability to influence the schools, for example. We've taxed them more, leaving them less time with their parents. We've provided them a culture which makes it difficult to raise their children. We've made discipline illegal. We've made fun of marriage. We've gone from favoring marriage to penalizing it. And I think basically we need to try getting back on the side of parents. One example of that that I've watched very closely is in Milwaukee, where the poorest parents were given a choice of schools. And these parents would fit a stereotype of parents who are too busy or unconcerned to care for the children. Turned out they were busy, but they weren't unconcerned. And when given a choice of a safe, good school that was in their neighborhood, they found a way to get to a parent-teachers meeting, because in order to choose that school, they were fined or their child was dismissed if they didn't go to the parents-teachers meeting. And so they, given a chance, they became responsible parents. So I'm going to vote on the side of making it easier for parents. And in your parents' school, and I'll wrap up with this point, what if everybody who was in the school chose to be there? And if the irate parent who called at 10 o'clock at night said, Ms. Smith, or whatever your dad or mom's name is, said, such and such, we don't like this school. And your mom or dad listens very carefully for a while and said, tell you what, your child must go to school under our rules, but you don't have to go to my school, so choose another one. Choose another one. I think for a teacher to be able to only choose students who choose that school, as long as the parents have a wide variety of choices for themselves, would completely change the atmosphere in the classroom and give some respect to parents. I mean, teachers as well as parents.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Good evening, Mr. Governor. First, I'd like to say I truly appreciate your sincere commitment to education and also your resolve to help make parents better parents. I agree with you that governing is not just about pushing our economy forward and raising our standard of living, but unfortunately I see that your tax code seems to make the assumption that with fewer taxes and more money back in the hands of families across America, that this money would somehow be used, parents would use this money to make time to become better parents, but is there any reason to necessarily believe that parents wouldn't necessarily pump this money back into the economy and we'd have a similar supply side situation that valued growth as we did in the 80s? Unfortunately, a lot of the parents that are having trouble are single parents that come from low socioeconomic standards and are fighting to get off of welfare or things like that. And some of the only support mechanisms they have are government programs and social services that are currently backlogged with work and bureaucracy and need some reforming and perhaps a little bit of money themselves. And I was wondering if you thought perhaps we could use some of the surplus to not just reduce taxes, but also to help those agencies help parents that are in a lot of trouble in terms of trying to get back on their feet. And if you could also answer, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Vermont state tax plan that redistributes property taxes. If you could also comment on that, I'd appreciate it. Thanks.
That's a mouthful and a good place to end. I think we got it. Working backwards, I am familiar with Vermont's state tax code. I think they missed a golden opportunity for, in order to provide more equity in the funding of students. The court ordered that the state had to find a way to equalize, make more equal the amount of money spent for each child. Most states have had to face this. Now, Vermont had the opportunity to take the money and just give it to the parents and let the parents choose among the schools. That would be perfectly equal. I mean, every parent would get $5,000 or $6,000, and then they could choose the best school for their child. Vermont has a tradition of school choice, St. Johnsbury Academy in northern Vermont and others, where local school boards have basically said, we'll give you $5,000, you go to any school you want to, you can spend it at a public school or a private school. That would have been a better way, I think, to do it than they did. The other point you mentioned is a very good one, and again, it's a basic philosophical difference. I believe that we will help, I believe that it is time to let middle and low-income families get a greater share of our new prosperity. And the choice is really, can we do that by creating new programs through the government and substituting our judgment for parents, or can we do that by leaving more money in the hands of middle and low-income families and letting them spend that as they choose? I would trust them with their monies to improve their lives more than I would trust the substitute programs and the experts. That's a very important philosophical difference that you point up, and I have a very clear view about which side of it I'm on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lamar, for candid and forthcoming address and answers. And I welcome you all again to the new academic year. The purpose of the forum, the dean has shared with you. It's a place to show civility and respect for the speakers, if not for their ideas or philosophies, as I say. And that's always good to rip into them. I mean, no, excuse me. No. Get carried away there. But you're very fortunate to be here. This is one great school. I went to the University of Wyoming, and that was a long way from here. But I can tell you it has been a great honor and privilege to do this in my temporary status. It's a fine staff and a fine dean, and Kathy McLaughlin over there is a fine deputy. I couldn't administer my way out of a paper sack, but she does a beautiful job of that. And a fine staff. Some of them are here tonight, and you'll get to know them all. They're accessible. They're here for you. It's an accessible faculty, an accessible administration. And the people who secure this building and maintain it are wonderful people too, and there they are right back there. It's a very important part of it, how it all works. So have a great adventure, and you will. And thank you, Lamar, for kicking off the fall semester with a very sincere and thoughtful address. And good night to you all, and thank you very much, and God bless you. Thank you. Apparently they are not doing.
Well, maybe. I'll stick around. I'm going on down to Washington. Oh, you are? So maybe. Okay. So I'll stick around here a minute.
Thank you again. We'll welcome you back.
Good luck fishing.
Well,
You've caught a big
ready.
one here.
Always ready.
We're both thinking about more fishing.
Hello, Bob. How are you? Do you know?
Hello.
How
How are you?
Bob?
Bob again. Nice to meet you.
Running for the treasurer.
I know. Good to see you, Alan. Well, you're going to want
Hey, what year are you now?
I'm a freshman. Just came.
You just got here.
Summer here, but I'm a freshman.
Good for you. What a great opportunity.
Thank you.